Hello, everybody. My name is Quivin Makirmisi, and this is the fourth part of the series I have created called What Was the USSR? Part 4, Breakdown and Collapse. Now, the title is based on a article I read online by Aufheben magazine, which is also called What Was the USSR? That goes into it in quite theoretical detail. This is my take on it, which is slightly more historically specific rather than theoretical. But we will be having at the end of it, there will be a theoretical summary of everything that we've been covering, and which I will attempt to summarize at the end. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so from the mid-1980s, a series of disasters begins to afflict the Soviet Union. You can see a picture of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant meltdown there on the left. Simultaneously, the Red Army was hopelessly embroiled in a costly and deeply unpopular war in Afghanistan. Very deeply unpopular not only in the world, but also in the Soviet Union itself, because there was very heavy casualties. Also, in a futile attempt, which had been adopted in the Brezhnev era and continued, where the Soviet Union tried to position itself as a superpower to rival the United States, and this failed catastrophically. Soviet military expenditure had risen to 27% of the national budget. It's almost unthinkable. And in the same period, it was the United States that was always propelling the arms race onwards, but the United States was able to keep its share of the national budget to just 7% at the height of the Cold War military expenditure race. Whereas the Soviet Union was using 27%. That's quite incredible. So the Chernobyl disaster, it exposed to everybody, including to people within the Soviet Union, of course, the sacrifices that working people were making for a system that had become mired in corruption and incompetence. The now octogenarian leadership of the USSR, that would be including the Politburo and the Central Committee, they were overwhelmingly people of 80 plus years, which is quite a bad situation. I mean, arguably, the United States is in a similar situation today, but the USSR was certainly gridlocked in this aging leadership in the latter years of the USSR, and it was looking for a savior. And along comes Mikhail Gorbachev. He was still, at the time, he was only in his 50s, and he was the only Soviet leader to have been born in the USSR's existence, and he was that man. So he told the world he wanted change, and the Western media's hype soon was buzzing around this charismatic and affable public persona that he projected, and it grew irresistibly. So it became very popular on the world stage. But in Russia, next slide, or in the Soviet Union, Yes, so behind all the fanfare, which included glasnost or new openness, and also perestroika, which was restructuring, bringing in elements of market economy into the system, though it was never exactly specified how this would take place, but it was all supposed to be on the cards. And the new president appeared on the streets to hear the views of ordinary people. This was unprecedented in the case of the USSR up until this point. But you know, how much of it was real and how much of it was fanfare is another thing altogether. But what was less commented on, nobody commented on this, but what he was asking for, he had this urgent emphasis on what he called an acceleration of the Soviet economy. Now, what's he mean by that? Well, it means an intensification of labor which ordinary people are going to put in. So studied in more detail, this means for workers that a Keynesian intensification of production would be required rather than the straight input of labor hours, regardless of work quality, that they put in before. So naturally, this made working class people in Soviet Union suspicious. But of course, in the West, they were all loving this, and they're thinking, finally, the Soviet Union is going to embrace a market economy and la la da. Right, next slide. So as part of glasnost, the full extent of the crimes committed during the Stalin period were first revealed to the public in the Week of Conscience. That was November 1988. And you can see some people looking rather distraught. They're looking at see if they can find any records of their loved ones who disappeared, who were sent to the Gulag, who, as I say, were disappeared by the secret police, whatever, and they find out about this. It has to be said, you know, that this was actually quite a big move. I mean, if you can think of what the extent of all these crimes were, I mean, you're talking millions of people, really, who had been either died because of the incompetences or of the and the disasters of the collectivization process, or who had been actually murdered by the regime. And you can imagine, you know, if a country like, say, Britain in Europe, if it was to say we're going to have a week of conscience about the slave trade, and we're going to expose all the people who we know were involved in the slave trade, and we're going to get as much detail as we can, and we're going to make it public. We're going to actually expose it as a government operation. It just wouldn't happen. So this is quite a big move by the Soviet Union in this regard. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so the actual position of the USSR was actually more dire than it cared to admit. So there was widespread public disillusionment with, and there was also economic, political, military problems. There was also a growing reliance on imported wheat from the USA to feed the people. Now, this also goes to outline that the Soviet Union was fully integrated. It might not have thought it was, or it might not have presented itself as such, but it was actually already fully integrated into the world market system, because it was importing wheat from the USA. At the same time, it was channeling fuel, as in petrol and gas, into Europe. So the wheat was coming in from one direction, and the fuel was going out in the other direction, and cash was being exchanged at both ends. So therefore, the Soviet Union, it's a fiction to say that the Soviet Union was not integrated into the world economy. But being in charge of price fixing, the nomenclatura reduced the relative cost of a bottle of vodka to that of 2 loaves of bread. In their eyes, it was better that people drown their sorrows rather than challenge the authorities, because everybody was going through sudden, they thought they were supposed to be doing one thing, and now they were being told, no, that was all a lie, and we're going to have to do it a different way now. So why not reduce the cost of a bottle of vodka so that everybody gets drunk instead of having to think about it? So the upkeep of the Warsaw Pact had also become unsustainable, both economically and politically. Jaruzelski in Poland was told that the Soviet Union would definitely not be intervening to save his political skin. And then a decision made by East German police not to fire on a protesting crowd in 1989. Obviously, it was to have profound consequences. This is what led to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And of course, it once again provided Western media with the spectacle it craved. And within a year, popular protests had unseated all the governments across the so-called Eastern Bloc, while Soviet troops were confined to barracks, and they would soon be recalled back to the USSR. And in fact, such protests were already being seen within the USSR itself. So you can see the Berlin Wall imagery there above, at the top there. Okay, next slide. So one by one, the Baltic, that's Lithuania, is example above. A Caucasian and the Central Asian Soviet Socialist republics, they experienced similar uprisings, or at least they decided that they wanted to go separate ways. And some of these uprisings took on an increasingly nationalistic flavor. That this was in particularly in the Baltic countries, and also in parts of the Ukraine, in particularly the west of Ukraine. And not only was anger being directed against the Soviet authorities and the security forces in this process, but also in some cases there was also severe ethnic or inter-ethnic violence going on, in particular Azerbaijan and Armenia, where there were mutual massacres of people just because they happened to be labeled Azerbaijani living in Armenian territory, or vice versa. And Soviet high command, for the most part, had realized that simple repression by military force of threats to the status quo was no longer an option. So within a year of the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and Comecon in 1990, USSR had broken down into multiple independent countries, as you can see in the map below. You can see that the Russian Federation is still the largest player, but it's of course the size of the country doesn't necessarily mean it's well developed or even has a high population. It certainly has in the West, but not in the East. So and then you can see all the other countries are now independent. So you've got Kyrgyzstan, and you've got Uzbekistan and Armenia, etc. at the bottom of the Caucasus, and Ukraine and Belarus and the Baltic states in the West. So the Soviet Union seems to be coming formally to an end. Next slide. So withdrawal from Central Europe was quickly followed by withdrawal from Afghanistan. The Soviet forces had pulled out of both because they quite simply could no longer hold them. But Gorbachev had been led to believe by Western powers, when they were deciding what to do with the former Warsaw Pact and all the rest of it, how to dismantle that. Gorbachev was led to believe that the West would honor these withdrawals and they wouldn't take advantage of them. That didn't happen either. The NATO started to advance in the late 1990s, and so this part of the bargain was not kept. The bargain was that there wouldn't be an advance of the NATO alliance, and of course there has been, and there's been consequences which we're dealing with right up to this very point in time. So, and similarly, when they pulled out of Afghanistan, the agreement was that Pakistan would drop its support of the Mujahideen, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and all the rest of it. And of course, they carried on ahead, and then we all know the consequences of that as well. So in August 1991, there was a brief coup attempt. It was rather quixotic, by elements of the USSR's old guard, who were trying to turn the clock back. It was a complete failure, and it had very little support, virtually zero support, in fact. But it achieved very little except to propel the highly ambitious neoliberal influenced Boris Yeltsin into power in the aftermath. And this completely sidelined the already terminally weakened Gorbachev. So in such a way was a new CIS, or Russian Federation, born. Next slide. So the CPSU had been disestablished from all power by the end of 1991, and it was replaced by an elected Duma and presidency in rough imitation of the United States. And one might think, oh, great, we've got an elected parliament, everything's going to be wonderful now. But of course, it didn't happen, because the policies that Boris Yeltsin had introduced, the shock therapy, which was actually taken from Western concepts, that had been originally tried in Chile and Argentina and places like this, and then was next implemented in Russia, and or in as many of the former Soviet socialist republics as they could get their hands on. And the Chicago boys went in there, and they basically privatized everything they could get their hands on. And they were assisted by former members of the nomenclatura within the apparatus, who were able to maximize on the mass privatizations through their networks that they built up under the USSR regime within the bureaucracy. And these men were soon to become Russia's hated oligarchs, hated by ordinary people, that is. The oligarchs remain to this day not highly unpopular in modern day Russia. So, and there was a gangland atmosphere of the later 1990s once Yeltsin got going with his shock therapy, and this mirrored that. For instance, that you can see in the picture on the right there, you know, this sort of worship of buying stuff and showing it off is sort of like a gangland. Well, there was actually gangs running around, and the whole economy had become a sort of gangster economy by the late 1990s, which mirrors, of course, that of the late 1920s, early 1930s United States, where in similar economic policies were held sway. This is the Hoover period in the United States. What am I thinking of? Yeah. So if you want to find out more about what they did to Russia in great detail, I would suggest that you read the book by Naomi Klein. It's called The Shock Doctrine, and there's a whole chapter there on what was done to the former USSR, in particular Russia. So you can see Yeltsin at the bottom there. There he is shaking hands with all the oligarchs. And there was also another incident which was very little commented on in the West. This was Boris Yeltsin's decision to shell the Russian parliament into submission in 1996 because they had challenged his decrees, and you can see that happening in the picture on the right. And you can imagine if this had happened, you know, previously, if the coup attempt people in 1991, for instance, had been shelling the Russian parliament then, well, there would have been all hell would have broken loose in the Western media. But when this happened, people just sort of, there was very little reaction at all. Next slide. So Yeltsin's reforms, in scare quotes, these were to bring catastrophic hardship to the working people of the CIS. The CIS actually is, although it's still going, the Confederation of Independent States, which replaced the Soviet Union, it's pretty much a dead duck. It's pretty much, but anyway, across a lot of the CIS states, the death rate soared up astronomically as industries closed en masse, pension funds were robbed, social security nets were eliminated, and public health was abandoned. So you can examine the 1990 censuses, and these reveal a population shortfall in the millions. So in many cases, these changes were every bit as drastic as and merciless to the poor as what happened under Stalin. And that is something, of course, which again is not commented about. Everybody wants to talk about what Stalin did, but they don't want to talk about what was done in the 1990s. It should also be pointed out, though, however, that not all of the regions of the CIS, nor all former members of the USSR suffered equally. The Baltic states, to a lesser degree, but certainly Belarus and Georgia initially, they escaped the desperation of the 1990s, mainly because they had not been quite so ruthless in the implementation of IMF World Bank recommendations. And indeed, in Belarus's case, they renounced them entirely. Next slide. So not only were the Yeltsin years to bring hard times to so many people, but he also started the transformation of Moscow and St. Petersburg, formerly known as Leningrad, into islands of financial and service economy prosperity, while the former industrial cities and the country towns and villages went into terminal stagnation with record levels of unemployment and deprivation. It has to be said this pattern is found across all economies where the neoliberal model has been used. It was particularly evident in the Russian Federation and those countries of the CIS which had adopted the neoliberal approach. And despite Russia's overall low to medium score for GDP, Moscow is, well, I was going to say today, it certainly was yesterday, but maybe not today. Maybe the prices are going to tumble there again because of the current situation, but certainly yesterday, in a figurative sense, it was the most expensive city to live in the entire world. I mean, that's quite incredible, really, when you consider that most of the country is in a really bad state. So Yeltsin was also the first regional leader since the Tsars to wholly embrace the Orthodox Church. This is the Russian Orthodox Church. Perhaps this is no surprise, as when a ruling elite has to dispense with one form of mystifying ideology, obviously it's got to adopt another one. So the Orthodox Church was there ready to jump into the gap, and Boris Yeltsin and later Vladimir Putin as well, of course, would lap it up. So the Russian Orthodox Church has been able to recoup its confiscated wealth and rebuilt destroyed churches, all lavishly decorated, and to be reinstated as the established church of the nation, again influencing decisions made by politicians on law and morality, whatever that means. Is this progress? Question. Next slide. So Yeltsin's successor, of course, we all know, is the former head of the KGB, FS/FSB, Vladimir Putin. And he has tried ever since he got into power. He was nominated as successor by Yeltsin there. He was declining in health somewhat. He was known for his drinking habits and various other failings. And Vladimir Putin was this nobody. Originally, he was a nobody in the KGB in Dresden, I think he was based, and he was supposed to be spying on people, and he apparently wasn't a very good spy, but he managed to get himself to the top or quite high up in the KGB, and then he became the head of the FSB once the title had changed at the end of the Soviet Union. And he's sort of played this sort of man for all seasons appeal to try and unify what is now Russia today. He appealed most consistently to a very conservative nationalistic sentiment, but he also plays on occasions, like when he sees it'll do him good, he plays to the deep sense of social neglect that people have been feeling, especially poor people, ever since the USSR, so that he can win that level of support as well. And then simultaneously, of course, he's currying favor with the circle of retainer oligarchs, and he needs to keep on side. He basically told the oligarchs, you either subordinate yourself to the state, and I'll leave you alone, and you can amass all whatever ill-gotten goods you want, and I won't bother with you. But of course, a lot of them didn't like that, and they fled the country, and then there were carry-ons ever since, as we all know about. So, contrary to the West's view of Putin as an autocratic despot, I would present that I have talked to many critical Russians, and they are much less impressed. They see him as a man lost in his own hubris, but in reality, he is a relatively weak player who's forced to appease competing state and oligarchic forces. It's important to see the rise of Vladimir Putin in this way. Previously, it was a free-for-all for the oligarchs under Yeltsin, and Putin comes in and he allows the state back into the equation. So it's a sort of compromise situation within the ruling elite. The state forces that were really feeling that they were being run down, the army was run down, and the navy was run down, and the actual all the things that were providing the glue that would keep the Russian society together, like sort of health service and all the rest of it, these, and education and everything, it was a way of bringing that glue together again, because it had all broken down, and as I say, there were very powerful people within the state who needed to be appeased. So he had to appease them, so he's playing this sort of balancing trick between very powerful oligarchs within who are still aligned to the Russian state, and the actual state bureaucratic forces themselves. Next slide. So small wonder then that there's a great nostalgia in the old USSR area, not just in Russia, it has to be said, for the old USSR. And this has arisen in all of its former territories that have been exploited and or excluded by the relentless forces of modernization, or what we would call modernization. A loaded term, that one. Within Russia, as in many of its now independent former dependencies, the main opposition to the ruling one, you wouldn't know this by watching Western media, is a new-ish social democratic version of the old Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation, as it still calls itself to this day. Its announcements in particular, well, they're riven by many contradictions. They sound socialist one minute and then nationalistic the next. But they are the main opposition party to Vladimir Putin, and the West can't get its head around this. It insists that Navalny is the Alexei Navalny, that he is the main opposition figure. Well, he's not, I'm afraid. And in contrast to retrograde hearkenings back to the now defunct USSR, however, talking about what's going on the left, there is a growing plethora of alternative left voices in Russia. These range from social democratic to green and anarchist. You can see there's an anarchist demonstration there on the left, who are slowly gathering strength and challenging the old monolithic Communist Party dogma, to revisit the past through a different light and to explore different perspectives as to what left approaches and objectives for the future might be. And unlike before, the CPRF has been forced to tolerate and learn from those whom it would have ignored and purged in the past. There's even some young people getting involved in the Communist Party nowadays, and they're towing a completely different line to what the Communist Party official policy is, and they're hoping to be elected on the ticket of the Communist Party, because the Communist Party is the most organized political opposition group in the country, but they have completely different politics to your normal old guard-y type Communist Party type people. Okay, I think that's the end of this part. Next slide. Yeah, so we're now going to go into some theory and analysis here. So I've got some funny pictures here, which will help us through what can be, when you go into theory and analysis, it can all get very heavy and deep. So so what I've done is I've thrown in some funny pictures to keep you interested. I thought before we begin, we need to establish briefly what communism is before we start on breaking down exactly what the USSR was and what socialism is as clear points of reference, because there seem to be many misunderstandings as to what we could mean by these terms. So we're going to ask ourselves first the question, what is communism? Well, firstly, this may sound like we're going into biology or something, but we won't stay there very long. But the human race shares 98.7% of its DNA with two primate subspecies that we are fairly close. We're fairly sure that we arise parallel to and probably out of, to a certain degree, these two species. So there are two of them, and the one is called the chimp and the other one's called the bonobo. Now, the chimp was most studied until recently, and past researchers have focused mainly on its tendency towards competition, aggression, and alpha male hierarchy rituals, because this seemed to justify the type of world in which they were living in, and therefore and to explain it. Now, this is not entirely the whole story, because more recent research has turned to focusing on the chimp's cooperative, gentler side. But it has to be said, has to be admitted, that while chimps do live in an environment where competition over resources is strong, they have big competition with gorillas and other larger apes. That may be why, because the chimp is larger than the bonobo, and also why it's more aggressive. Anyway, so the bonobo, on the other hand, has no hierarchy structure whatsoever, beyond a sort of deference to the eldest female in times of crisis. Basically, they go, well, should we go this way to get some food, or should we go that way? And she says, I would go that way because I've been around longer than you have. Obviously, so she doesn't say that in language. She says that with eight methods of communication, but it's the same sort of thing. So bonobos are peaceful and they cooperate closely, even with other bonobo bands. So when another bonobo band arrives on the scene, they don't start parading about and getting aggressive with each other like chimps do, and getting angry and maybe even killing each other. No, bonobos deal with it completely differently, and they often they sit around and they share and they have fun together, and they share food and all this sort of stuff. They place a priority emphasis on social fun wherever possible, empathic contact, enjoyment, and games. So I've got a funny there on the left, and that's just to explain all that. Okay, next slide. So by taking into account that chimps are near identical to bonobos, apart from their environment and their size, but the size probably arises out of the environmental circumstances, it therefore follows that our own species' origins and instinctive inclination is towards communism, which puts it at a far cry from Hobbes's imagined all against all. Hobbes was a 17th century English philosopher who coined this idea that we need the state in order to stop us killing each other. Basically, this is what he imagined, and he imagined a state if we didn't have if we didn't have a state, then we'd all be clubbing each other over the heads or eating each other or something stupid. And in fact, as anthropology shows, like the Iroquois village, which is shown there over on the right, some form of communism is evident across the world and amongst all communities where classes, social classes, do not exist, and where producers cooperate in order to fulfill their needs and desires of the moment. This has been consistently found throughout anthropology. The rise of social classes, however, this can be linked to environmental stress as much as it does with chimps and bonobos. And it possibly could have led to the creation of a non-producing class that thrived on sustaining this conflict and competition even after need for it had dissipated, because it got something out of it. So this development is not linear, of course, and this is another thing, this again ties into what we're talking about with the stages theory. One thing leads to another thing, leads to another thing, leads to another thing. No, history and archaeology show us that his development, the social development, is not linear. The class tensions that arise in societies, they increase, and then they reach a height, and then they reduce or are even eliminated as the relative power of the producers versus the non-producers oscillates. The class conflict in England during the 16th to 17th centuries, however, this shifted the balance dramatically by first expropriating, so the peasants were driven off the land, and then they were turned into proletarians, basically workers without land, so that they could be turned into commodities to be bought and sold by capital. And the only way that you could get your means of subsistence and reproduction was to sell yourself in the marketplace, and that way you would get your food or whatever, or your shelter. Next slide. So despite creating a ruthlessly more efficient mode of production than its predecessors and succeeding in spreading it across the globe, capitalism was unable to escape the internal contradictions of itself, and indeed only heightened them. So when or wherever this system weakens, this hierarchical system, which is now based on, as I said, on the commodification of labor, whenever this weakens, then the producers will again reassert themselves. And it's a fact to this day that the reconstructive steps made by a producer-led uprising lead into, in pretty much all cases, or in some cases, and imagined back to, a form of communism, meaning the direct workers' control over the means of production. Also, as capitalism is driven forward by its need to expand, it's part of its contradiction. It has to do that or it dies. So but as it does so, it increases the potential for communism to do the same. The move towards communism is instinctive and formed in struggle, so it's not ideological. This is a crucial point. It arises out of producer needs as the circumstances arise. It's a form taken by every producer insurrection, from the Anabaptists to the Paris Commune, the 1905 Soviets, the 1917 Soviets. These are Soviets with a small s. These are the workers' committees or councils, workers and peasants. 1936 in Spain and beyond. And you can see this is a picture from which we used in the first part. actual working workers Soviet in, I think it's in Petrograd or in Moscow during 1917. So all the decisions are taken by everybody who works in the factory. It's also the form of social reorganization taken by producers who manage to temporarily escape the capitalist order through natural or man-made disasters. One example was in Argentina in 2001, where the rulers of the country, the oligarchs, the equivalent of oligarchs in Argentina, they fled the country with the financial collapse, with all the money, and they left, and they closed down all the factories, and they just left everybody to die. This didn't happen because the workers went in, they reoccupied the factories, they got them going again, and they did without money, because you couldn't even get money out of the holes in the wall on the side of the road. You couldn't get it. So they had to find some other way, and they did so. Society was able to survive with minimal casualties. Quite incredible. Next slide. So this is finish off on communism. This is communism alive in the world today. Communism alive in the cracks of the capitalist global monolith today, as I've called it here. I've given a few examples. A lot of these organizations are all connected up with each other, and there's many more going on. There's a documentary I was just watching the other night on Chile, Santiago Rising, and it's quite, you can see the same processes are what happened in Chile in 2020, where the society was breaking down, and the people were trying to find ways of reorganizing society, and they automatically go back to some form of communistic type redistribution of wealth. And you can see, so the examples I've used here, these are Marinaleda, Spain. You can see the land reoccupations that have been going on since the 1980s. They have reoccupied land that was just lying waste, owned by private landlords, and they have built quite incredible quality public housing. You can see a row of houses there, and the place, and they don't allow police into the town either. It's very well organized, and it's organized from the bottom up, not from the top down. The Zanon worker-occupied ceramics factory, they occupied the factory. It's a ceramics one. This is they occupied it during 2001, and it's still going. It's actually quite famous, this one, the Zanon. And the Zanon workers went to support the repurposed factory in Thessaloniki, where again the workers took over the running of the factory, and they repurposed it because it was producing this very toxic chemical. And the factory workers, once they had taken control of it, and they'd driven off the police, they now produce organic soap. and they are very well supported by the local community. So that's the VOME, I think is how you pronounce it. I think it's an abbreviation, but anyway. Then you have commune councils in Rojava, Syria. These emerged during the breakdown of society in Syria, and they in the north of Syria, despite all the invasions and the ongoing war that's still going on there, these communes are still going in some form or another. And these again are community-led organizations from the bottom up. And the idea is to redistribute the land and to basically involve people in running their own society. The Zapatistas, again, they're on the right. They have been going, of course, they were quite well known in the 1990s. But what most people don't realize is that they are still going. Most people think, oh, they sort of disappeared, but they haven't disappeared. In fact, they've expanded the land which is now autonomously held and communalized, and they are actually they're actually I think they've even doubled it in size. These are predominantly Mayan indigenous people, and you can see them wearing their traditional balaclavas, which is a ironic comment. They all wear it. They say you only we wear the masks so that you will see us, meaning that they were completely ignored before, and it's only by wearing the masks that this gets them attention. But they're doing very well, and they are organizing it. And as I say, there's not just these, it's anywhere where capitalism is breaking down, you see these sort of improvised methods emerging. And it sort of gives us an idea, if capitalism did completely break down, then, you know, it wouldn't be the end of the world. It would mean that people would just start to reorganize themselves, as I say, in relation to producers, how producers would organize normally themselves. So which is a communistic one. Okay, next slide. So what is socialism? Okay, well, although the terms communism and socialism are often blurred, and they've become indistinct, it's very important for our upcoming theory of the USSR to distinguish between the two. Now, historically, the term socialist arose out of the split in the first Working Men's International of 1871, when it was used to identify the followers of Karl Marx, together with some unaligned associates, such as the British Labour Party, who believed in a vague parliamentary road to socialism. And it was to divide them off from actually the anarchists who are under Bakunin, and they actually were called, from that point on, they were called the communists. Of course, there would be another switch of terms later on, but in the 19th century, if you were labeled a communist, that probably meant you were an anarchist, or at least an anarcho-syndicalist. By the Second Working Men's International, a concept of how socialism would arise was cast in the stages theory. We've already talked about that. The stages theory is one where it's seen as being a linear development. So you move from feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism somehow in this sort of progressive thing, like you're going upstairs or something. Nearly all the attendees at the Second Working Men's International 1889, they all agreed upon this. And this lays the emphasis away from workers' struggle and onto structural changes, which can be, as I said, through all these stages. And communism is the final stage. It's sort of visioned as something off in the distance, always abstracted instead of grounded in concrete reality. Now, we've just been talking about the concrete reality of real communism, but the communism as viewed from the socialist point of view, it's something off in the distance, something pie in the sky, up in the clouds. You don't really think about it. You are too busy with socialism, and you'll probably never get there. A remarkably naive approach to the state as being a somehow neutral body that can be put to use for working class ends also prevails in socialism. This meant that back in the 1890s, it meant that the way was now open for social democratic parties to enter parliaments, ostensibly to bestow working class demands graciously from above as their elected representatives, instead of the workers actually getting up and simply taking it themselves. Much more practical. In his final years, Marx, he despaired of socialist political opportunists. You've got an angry Marx cartoon there next to the writing in red. He said that they were simplifying and misapplying his critique of capitalism to their own dubious ends. And in a last letter to his daughter Eleanor, he remarked with anger, "Je ne suis pas un marxiste," or "I'm not a Marxist." That's quite interesting quote, which not many people know. Next slide. So the Russian Social Democratic Party, as I say, we've been talking about how the Social Democratic Party arose and how it's linked to socialism. Well, it was no exception to the above, except that in Russia, of course, there was no parliament of any consequence. In fact, there wasn't any up until about 1905, and that one didn't last very long either. So this led to a split between the Bolsheviks, who were advocating a rapid seizure of the state by a working class vanguard, namely themselves, and the Mensheviks, who preferred to wait for the bourgeois state to arise so that they could do what the other STPs were doing in places like Germany and get themselves elected and go to parliament and be bought off by the capitalists. Oops, I shouldn't have said that. Anyway, in essence, socialism is a belief that the route to workers' power lies either through an elected parties, if it's reformist, or vanguard parties, if it's revolutionary, control over the state. This is the key point here. They believe that if they can get control of the state, then everything's going to be wonderful. They'll just be able to pass legislation and they'll be able to reach communism through passing these resolutions so that you get to socialism and then eventually to communism. And until the day that structural changes allow the working class to passively achieve communism, the vanguard or its social democratic equivalent will have to look after the capitalist state. And of course, if it's looking after the capitalist state, it will have to make deals with internal capitalists and or surrounding capitalist powers. Now you can start to see why governments, whether they call themselves socialist or whether they call themselves capitalist or whatever they call themselves, or Saudi Arabia or whatever, it hardly calls itself either of those, but they're basically doing exactly the same thing. So the socialist project is essentially opposed to communism as we've described it previously, as we've been describing it. It's basically opposed to it. It's to do with making a deal with capitalism. It's not to replace capitalism or to throw it out the window. So I've got a couple of funnies here. And so you've got Animal Farm Part 1 with Stalin and Churchill. That's the revolutionary wing of Animal Farm. As we know, Animal Farm is where the pigs all are, the walking, talking pigs are conferring with the farmers. And Animal Farm Part 2, the reformist wing. So that's Tony Blair with big media mogul. What's his name again? Murdoch. Yeah. So although the Russian Social Democratic Party, the Bolshevik wing, they would later muddy the waters by calling themselves the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and through the Comintern tell other social democratic parties to follow suit. Its program remained at best socialist, as herein described. And due to the peculiar circumstances of its genesis, one that was also subject to dogmatic, paranoid, and authoritarian distortions. So it's from here that we can proceed to our summary of what was the USSR. Next slide. So party makeup and botched policies. So both wings of the Russian Social Democratic Party, leaderships in the 1903, that was when they split, to 1917 period, were dominated by an urban intelligentsia. And often these people originated from low-ranking members of the aristocracy or the professional classes, because after all, by and large, only such people in the Russian Empire had the means or education to support themselves as professional revolutionaries. This was the phrase which they chose, that, that they would be the professional revolutionaries who would lead the vanguard in the revolution, etc., especially in the Bolsheviks. And this was unfortunate in a country that was still 80 to 90% peasantry. And furthermore, it goes without saying that these same urban revolutionaries had inherited the patronizing contempt of their original class for the former, unmitigated by the direct practical experience of interacting with the peasantry that their ancestors, meaning actual landowning aristocrats, could not have avoided. So this explains the complete failure of the Bolsheviks to understand the peasants. So, and then the dogma of the stages theory didn't help. So applying the Franco-German petit bourgeois peasant model from Marx onto a still communal living peasantry where only 1% were living off the labor, entirely off the labor of others, this was a complete catastrophic mistake. So I've got a couple of funnies here. I can't do Russian accents, so I'll have to make them Irish. So, so one peasant is saying to the other peasant, "Hey, Ivan, we're bourgeois. Didn't you know, man? I must remember yon. Next time I'm hauling barges on the Volga, because this is what they actually did. They actually, you know, these supposedly petty bourgeois peasants were, you know, they had to sell their labor and they had to haul barges. I'm not talking like getting horses or something to do it. It's like humans. Humans are actually tied to ropes, and they're hauling these barges along the Volga. And then the bottom one is this is the one of the factories in Petrograd, and there's a crowd outside. So, which is indicating this wee cartoon is just that how closely linked even the working classes in revolutionary period Russia were connected to the peasantry. That, you know, their relatives were living in the countryside, and they were living in the city, but you know, they were very closely connected to the peasants. And in fact, there was very close connections between the peasantry and the workers during the early stages of the Russian Revolution. They were trading information between each other, and they also were organizing along very similar lines themselves, organizing themselves to form the workers' committees, the peasants' committees in the countryside. However, to take power, that's power over the state, the Bolsheviks joined together with a radical revolutionary party, the left SRs, or the left socialist revolutionaries, who derived support from the peasantry. And, you know, these people, they knew the peasantry, and they had a lot of interaction with them, and they could have guided their allies through the minefield. But instead, the Bolsheviks got rid of them at the first opportunity. That wasn't a very smart move. Next slide. So, supporters of the World Revolution, well, you know, the Bolsheviks, certainly in the period 1917 to 21, they claimed to be supporters of World Revolution. Well, there certainly was a big window of opportunity that existed for that to take place in the aftermath or the collapse of various powers within Europe at the end of the First World War. So Italy was near collapse, Austria-Hungary was near collapse, Russia had collapsed, Germany was on the brink, and France and Britain went too far behind. And the global anger, there was a real sense by 1917, certainly after 1916, you've got this real sense of anger, especially in working class communities, felt against all of the capitalist imperialist powers. So you could argue the first act of a revolutionary government should have been to tell the Axis there will be no treaties. Why sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk? As you know, you could have said, as revolutionaries, we don't need bourgeois treaties, but you know, no war will be waged from this moment on. So, you know, we're not going to fight you, but you know, except the only war that's going to be waged is a class war. So stay where you are, come on in, your fate will be the same. And Germany, actually, this is what Miria Spiridonova, whom we've already talked about, this is what she was driving at, and she was summarily dealt with by the Bolsheviks. Germany actually needed a signed treaty, I would argue, much more than the Bolsheviks needed one. The Russian army had already disintegrated. You know, they couldn't fight in a traditional sense anyway. So there was no point in signing away the territories that they did at Brest-Litovsk, and it just wasted time by doing so, I would argue. Because, you know, if Germans wanted to come in, well, they could have come in, but you know, they would have faced a guerrilla war, and the German army didn't want that. German army wanted to get the resources out of Russia, but they didn't want to fight a guerrilla war that would eat up the German army, which they needed on the Western Front. So, you know, it was a game of bluff, and I think the Bolsheviks were bluffed. The Bolsheviks' leadership, of course, they couldn't have prevented the SDP of Germany and of other countries, which we talked about in part one, of making their own betrayals and blunders of their own later on. But an affected nonchalance towards signing the treaty would have put the Axis General Staff, you could argue, in an impossible situation. And this would have concluded the war quicker. It could also have precipitated a more coordinated worker-soldier-led revolution in Germany itself. As we've already discussed, there were several revolutions in Germany between 1918 and roughly 1920, and but they all kicked off at different times. There was about half a dozen of them or so, and they all kicked off at different times. And because of that, and because of the attitude of the Social Democratic Party, who was in power, arming the Nazis to suppress them, it didn't happen. But if it had happened, then France and Britain would have been on the brink as well, because the war wasn't popular there either. And we might not have had to endure World War II and another 100 years of capitalism. That's just a thought for you to think on. Next slide. Right, so we're going to talk about the possibility of the emergence of a new class. Is this what's going on? Is it just some blunders that they made, or was it worse than that? So the funny I've used here is from the cartoon movie of Animal Farm, with Napoleon in the middle and his two henchmen on either side, and of course representing Stalin. And it's accompanied by a quote which was used as a joke in the Soviet Union, just in the final years of the Soviet Union. People said, because they obviously realized that they were going back to capitalism, or to full-blown capitalism. So they said socialism was a final stage. You know, we're talking about the stages theory between capitalism and capitalism. It was a joke. So far, we've been giving the Bolsheviks stroke CPSU, so Communist Party of Soviet Union, a fairly relatively easy time of it. Yes, they made mistakes and they got things wrong, but you know, surely their aims were pure and they were human beings. Yeah, surely we all make mistakes. So internal Marxist-Leninist party debate has tried to wrestle with this problem ever since Trotsky wrote The Revolution Betrayed, all without coming to a satisfactory conclusion. Trotsky claimed that yes, a workers' state had been achieved, but it was a Bonapartist bureaucratic tendency that had later degenerated and deformed it. This is all ideological bunkum. Non-Leninist communists, these are people like the Council Communists, like Gottlieb, they tried to also explain its way. They didn't really succeed either, but they put the blame on the peasantry and Russians' backwardness. And Mao's view, of course, he was a Marxist-Leninist, of course, but a different sort. He said that the CPSU was on course. It was all fine, working fine, until it took a revisionist turn in 1953 to 56. Now, what's extraordinary about all these positions taken by Marxists on the problem of analyzing the USSR is that none of them, with one or two exceptions, have applied the full rigor of Marx's critique, his methods of critique, to the phenomenon, and have instead resorted to unconvincing and unscientific ideologized meanderings around the subject. Therefore, if we're going to interrogate what the USSR actually was, then we need to examine not only its form, this is from, using Marxian techniques, but also its social relations and the evidence of class struggle. So next slide. So we can very simply demonstrate that communism, that's the intrinsic form of working class organization, which we've already described above. This was never on the CPSU agenda, as otherwise the party would have left the already functioning workers' parties, workers and peasants Soviets to their own devices and only assisted them to coordinate against whatever threat, be it white or interventionist or whatever, and needs like feeding the people, which is obviously very important, that was prominent during the transition. However, the crushing of the autonomous green peasant areas, this was a term used for the peasant areas during the Civil War. They were called green because they were autonomous, and the only reason why they made themselves hostile to the Reds was that the Reds were requisitioning the grain that they needed to survive, and that was requisitioning by force, and the peasants didn't like that. They also didn't like the white armies running through either, and they fought them as well, and they fought the interventionists. We've already been talking about the Makhnovists in part 1, and the 1921 Kronstadt Rising, which of course, this puts the CPSU's intentions, there must have been some reason for all this beyond just making mistakes. It puts it beyond the shadow of a doubt. We can also challenge even the idea that the new regime was socialist, as the body chosen by the workers, namely the Soviet Congress, for the transition to socialism, was transformed into a bureaucratic appendage of the CPSU. Its self-organizing workers' Soviet councils at the base were, within a very short time, they were closed down within a year or two. And even internal dissent within the CPSU itself was eventually silenced. We already covered this with the workers' opposition in part 1. For sure, a mixed economy, as was followed under the 1922 New Economic Policy, or NEP, this bears some resemblance to social democracy as we understand it, at least in the economic and cultural sense, if not in the political one, which is much more repressive, much more centralized, but such reforming policies, of course, not unique to governments that call themselves socialist. There are many instances of even monarchies introducing reforming policies that could be seen as being socialist up to a certain degree. So we shouldn't really take it as being that the 1920s was a glory period for the Soviet Union either, or that it was trying to really achieve some sort of socialist or outcome. The key defining feature of socialism, as we said, is it seeks its accommodation with capital, not its overthrow. It doesn't resolve capital's contradictions. This helps us to get to the bottom of what socialist as a term means in the case of the Soviet Union. So this is a slide which used from part 3, and this is a picture that was suppressed during the 1920s. And it's a I put some words to it. So let's get this straight. Which game are we playing today? Is it capitalists or nomenclatura? Same game. Next slide. So to further outline my argument here, I put Lenin and Stolypin side by side. Now, Stolypin was the Tsar's advisor. He was assassinated in 1907. But both he and Lenin shared an appreciation of Russia's backwardness in capitalist terms. Both understood that a Russian bourgeoisie in the classic sense did not really exist. And therefore, if progress was to be achieved, this is again your stages theory here. So you've got to move directly where you can only move from feudalism into capitalism, and then you got to go on to socialism and So both of them realized, I mean, obviously, Stolypin was definitely not a social democrat, but he appreciated in the same way as Lenin did that they would have to create in order to compete with the West. Again, compete is another key term here. They would have to create a bourgeoisie. So this was approaching the situation from the view of a technocrat being tasked with a problem. That's one perceived from an elite perspective. As far as the workers were concerned, workers and peasants, it wasn't a problem. We just moved directly from the society we've got into communism. We're not going to bother with all this carry on, but people like Lenin, it really bugged them because they were thinking in structural terms. And they're thinking in competitive terms because they're thinking, well, how are we going to compete with all these advanced capitalist countries like Britain and France and America and so on and so forth. And one of Lenin's favorite terms is, of course, Fordism. Now, Ford was an American manufacturer, and he had developed a whole system where he was basically of factory production, where you basically saw the workforce as though they were cogs in the machine. So if this was where Lenin was going, then he's actually he's actually idolizing the terms and the objectives of capitalism. So developing the nation is paramount for both of these people, both Stolypin and Lenin, and the good of the people comes in a poor second in this deliberation at best. So Stolypin aimed to follow the classic English example. That's the English example of rising into capitalism. You encourage this entrepreneur class to rise from the peasantry, a yeoman class, And so Stolypin tried to do it that way. Lenin, however, he claimed that the CPSU could do it if they grabbed hold of the capitalist state and they guide the country, because they're principled revolutionaries, of course, they guide the country to socialism through capitalism. That means capitalism in structural sense, of course, means factories and oil and coal and all these sorts of things, electrification. Whereas actually, as we've already discussed, it doesn't necessarily mean that at all. What is of interest is how both of them attempted to develop the economy via bureaucratic means. Stolypin wasn't going to let this happen naturally. His idea to create a yeoman class, so he engineered with the Tsarist bureaucracy to create one. Whereas Lenin's approach is slightly different, but it's fairly similar. And this is a precedent going all the way back in Russia's case to Peter the Great. Peter the Great did this way back in the 18th century. He wanted to catch up with the West, and he was going to use the bureaucracy to implement the changes which he thought would be required in order for Russia to catch up. And both men wanted to catch up with the West by forcing through some sort of imitation of Western developments. So I think Stolypin and Lenin actually do belong on the same page. It has to be said that both men too valorized the concept of work. Now, the concept of work is not it's certainly not a communist idea. It's a capitalist idea. In fact, it goes all the way back to, the valorization of work goes all the way back to John Locke and people like this. It's a concept of bourgeois origin. So why, if they're communists or socialists, even socialists, why are they so? Why do they valorize this concept of work? Okay, next slide. So once the troublemakers, whether they're socialist or communist, are out of the way in 1921, it's time to put the grand plan into action on a scale that Stolypin would have been envious of. Of course, Lenin doesn't get to do it because he falls ill and then just dies. And Stalin is left to do it. And of course, Stalin's approach would probably have been different to Lenin's, and we've been interested to see how different Lenin's approach would have been. But what left Lenin's preference was to, his initial preference was to push these changes through under a continuation of war communism, but he did realize that this would be disastrous, hence the new economic policy as a stopgap. He did at least realize that. Stalin had different ideas. So what were the relationships that were beginning to emerge? That's the relationships of overproduction that were beginning to emerge as the USSR coalesced. Well, it had no national bourgeoisie, as we've already spoken about. So the state took control of the major industries to begin with, and very soon, it took control of all of them. It also ran the banks and the organs normally associated with the police, such as the army, the police, law, etc., and it printed money. And this is very important because money, the existence of money, is essential to maintaining and for reproducing capitalist social relations. And yes, the workers were indeed paid wages. The wages were set by the central bureaucratic apparatus, so one can argue on this level that it wasn't a market economy. However, following Marx, one should primarily look at who's in control of the labor. It doesn't matter what structural form is. You look at who is in control of the labor and whether this relationship is an exploitative one. This is the production of an alienated surplus value. So it doesn't matter whether it's being alienated by a private company or whether it's being alienated by the state, and whether there's growth going on. So, which there certainly was in the Stalinist period, huge rates of growth, and the existence of class struggle in these relations indicates the system's real character, regardless of any ideology it may espouse. I mean, as I say, Saudi Arabia has a complete, it doesn't espouse a capitalist ideology, it espouses a fundamentalist Islamist one, but the relations of production within Saudi Arabia are capitalist ones, and I don't think many Saudis would deny this. So the you know, it's the ideology that is, in many ways it can be a way of concealing what's actually really going on underneath it. You know, same within Western societies, you've got democratic, so-called democratic societies, and oh yeah, we've got a democracy, but the actual relationships of production are capitalist. So as a peasant under collectivization, you were definitely not in control of your own land and labor, and nor were you in a factory. Your labor was now exploited by the state instead of private capitalists. But you know, the state decided to spend it on whatever it thought was important, not what you thought was important. So, you know, it decided, for instance, in the 1970s or 1950s to 70s, decided to concentrate on the arms race or the space race or whatever else took its fancy. It wasn't interested in what you wanted, which was obviously better housing, better medical services, better standards of living. Next slide. So the Gulag was a case in point where you were literally turned into a commodity. So this is where this emulates, almost down to, you know, it emulates it very clearly, emulates a slave trade in early capitalist development. So you would essentially be bought and sold, whether in the form of black or real money, to project enterprise, project enterprise managers who needed labor by the secret police chiefs, who to all intents and purposes made a profit out of you. And labor was always a short supply in the USSR. So, you know, this is, if you went into the secret police and you got up to the top of it, then this is like what you would be doing. You would be buying and selling. You'd be buying and selling labor basically to enterprise managers, and you would get all the kudos, the black or the real money out of the transaction, and you would make quite a packet. So you're being a capitalist, are you not? Again, the expropriation of the peasantry, it follows the primitive accumulation of capital model, which we've been talking about, the expropriation of the peasantry. This is how the English capitalist class achieved their wealth through that and the slave trade. So you're following both of these processes to their ultimate conclusion. So how is this different for, you know, what way is this socialist or is it capitalist? The state from the 1930s extracted virtually the entire proceeds of each collectivized farm produced by this process at a forced and artificially lowered price. Then it sold it back again on the open market to capitalist states at an inflated one. So, again, this is another classic example of capitalism at work. But before we conclude, let's examine the class struggle within the authoritarian socialist system of the USSR. As might be expected, this took on new forms that were unique to the exceptional situation. So the enterprise managers, they're key to detecting this, because we know that they secretly watered down a lot of the most draconian measures against the workers, because unlike the CPSU nomenclatura in their offices, these guys are actually having to deal with the workers face to face, in much the same way as a line manager in a private capitalist enterprise might do. So there's not a lot of difference here either. This was not necessarily a humanitarian gesture on the part of the enterprise manager, because they needed some sort of target fulfillment, like getting a red tick in your book or a gold star, in order to compete against the rival enterprise managers on the same game of achieving black and bureaucratic career perspective. But what it is evidence of class struggle, and it's also evidence that the enterprise managers, they were competing against each other. So therefore, this is another sign that they are, in some form or another, they're very similar to how capitalist enterprise managers or whatever will compete with each other. So this guy is saying, in the funny here at the bottom, there's a lot of anxious workers gathered around, and he's saying, let's make a deal here, guys. You pretend to work and I'll pretend to pay you. How does that sound? And this is another joke from the late Soviet period that passed around in the USSR. Next slide. So, being alienated from the means of production, that means the factories and the land, and also prevented from organizing collectively in any meaningful sense by heavy state repression, the only option for workers engaged in the class struggle of daily existence, because workers do engage in the class struggle of daily existence, this goes on everywhere in the world that the capitalist system is in operation, is to go slacken the job, to absent themselves, and to perform poor quality work. Now, as I say, this also happens under normal capitalism, but because it's the only method open to workers, it happened to an unprecedented degree in the USSR, to such an unprecedented degree that it actually helped to bring down the entire system. So in some ways, it's a tribute to the resilience of the Soviet working class, even under the most adverse circumstances imaginable, that they're still highly successful in reducing the rate of growth to such a degree that by the late 1970s, from the high point, as we were saying, of the 1930s to 50s, it was all coming to a complete full stop. So the conclusion can lead us to examine glasnost and perestroika through new revealing lens. Viewed from a working class perspective, the latter measures were an attempt to move from an old mode of surplus extraction that exploited you through input of laboring hours to a more contemporary one that exploited you through the intensity of your work on the job. This is an idea which started with Keynesianism, and I would argue, for instance, with neoliberalism, it actually what they want is both of those. They want both more laboring hours and the intensity of your work, so that they can make more profit. So in the funny, here's the Gorbachev picture we had earlier, and he's saying, all together now, accelerate the economy. So small wonder then that the workers were by and large either indifferent to or suspicious of the changes proposed in the perestroika period. The end of the USSR came when the nomenclatura and the enterprise managers had together decided that the bureaucratic form of capitalist exploitation had run its course. And from now on, an openly capitalist mode would be required. And this also explains how fast changes can occur, because it all happens within an elite. The elite have got disillusioned with the bureaucratic mode of capital extraction and have switched to a full market one. Okay, so this is pretty much wrapping it up now. I would say that there is more to this story. I realized that there were a lot of people who dedicated their lives to the communist movement as it existed in the world in this period, including in the Soviet Union, and they either were unaware of, or they didn't, or they chose not to look at the flaws and the problems of all this. But that's really another story which I haven't really got time for, because there is another side to it in relation to that. But as I say, I haven't got time for it. I just wanted to get through the critique. We've got a final slide coming up now, which is a funny. Yeah, so this is the 1960s Star Trek TV series, and Captain Kirk's there on the left, and Dr. McCoy is on the right, and there's a strange glowing alien body, which is the coat of arms of the Soviet Union, on the USS Enterprise, and Kirk is going, well, what is it, Bones? And Dr. McCoy replies, it's capitalism, Jim, but not as we know it. So hope you got the joke. Anyway, that's the end of this discussion, and I hope you've appreciated what I'm trying to drive at.